the West, LGBT, and religion. Welcome back to Forgotten Country. I'm your guest host, Mohamad, aka That Muslim Guy. And today is the first episode of an 8-part series on the LGBT movement. We will discuss how it started, where it's going, and how this agenda seems to be pushed from the top down. For many of us living in the West, we have colleagues, coworkers who identify as part of the LGBT community. And in the past few years, we've seen a surge in the LGBT movement in every aspect of life. We've also seen corporations championing this movement to an unprecedented degree. This has led many to believe that this woke corporate agenda is simply meant to be a diversion. So let's dive deeper into that. After the 2008 financial crisis, the corporate sponsorships of the LGBT and feminist agendas and movements have grown drastically. Corporations saw that people were actually focusing on real economic and political issues. Remember Occupy Wall Street? That movement was a direct result of the Citizens United Supreme Court case, which granted corporations the ability to spend unlimited amounts of funds on elections, influencing elections, stealing our democracy. This growing awareness by the public over these actual economic and political issues really alarmed corporations. And so they had to give people a cause to fight for, a cause that wouldn't harm corporate interests. Therefore, they focused on convincing the public that the real problem was the white, straight male patriarchy, instead of focusing on the real economic maldistribution of wealth and corporate hegemony over the government, aka corporate totalitarianism. This made it easy for corporations to sell the solution, as opposed to actually conceding the real demands and needs of the people, the things that they really need and want. So, if the problem is that gay people are oppressed, then all a corporation or a state institution has to do is put a gay person in a position of power, a position of influence. And the masses who have been duped are now pacified. Therefore, forget about your rights as employees, forget about the wages that have remained stagnant for decades, while the cost of living has skyrocketed out of control, while executive pay has increased handsomely. Forget about the billions and trillions of dollars spent on wars. Don't focus on that stuff, don't focus on those outrages. Take a look at these woke diversions that we're throwing your way. Focus your outrage on that direction. For starters, we can trace all of this back to the Enlightenment Era in the mid-1600s to 1800s. People started questioning the authority of religion and religious institutions. Once people started rebelling against religion, scripture, rejecting God, the floodgates were open. Now, in godless societies, rather than following divine command, people just follow their own desires. Furthermore, over 200 years ago, we had colonizers that wanted to defeat their colonial Muslim subjects in North Africa and Southeast Asia. And of course, the best way to do this was to attack Islam. How did they do this? Well, they started propagating that Muslim men mistreat their women, and Islam is oppressive towards women and therefore needs reform. How will these women be liberated, you may ask? Through Western colonizers' imposition of women's rights and liberation movements. For a clear example of this, read Modern Egypt by Lord Cromer, who ruled Egypt and did the bidding of the British Empire. He clearly discusses how these Mohammedans, which is what they called Muslims by the way, they needed to be educated on European values, and the only way to do this was to reform Islam and strip away the religion from them. And one of the main ways to colonize Egypt was under the guise of women's liberation and women's rights. But we know what they say, when you play with fire, you'll get burned. Think of this as a dangerous virus in a lab. Sooner or later, there will be a contamination, it will escape, and it is contagious. And in this case, their women's liberation scheme was beyond their control. And it made its way back to Europe and North America, and it came in the form of modern-day feminism. This was followed by questioning gender roles, how there's no difference between men and women. Feminists started deeming a man who was working and earning a living in order to spend on his family. They started deeming that as oppressive to women. Women being caretakers, being fully provided for, was deemed as being useless and meaningless. So they started pushing women onto the workplace and into the workforce. Then feminism moved from just gender roles to gender identity and how everything is a social construct. Forget our differences biologically and physically and psychologically and emotionally. Forget all that. To them, it's all a social construct. Then, the sexual revolution associated with second-wave feminism combined with the invention of the birth control pill, well, this saw a rise in sexual promiscuity. There was a rise in premarital relations and also in sexual deviation. This was simply paving the way for many more deviations to come. And speaking of the birth control pill, let's talk briefly about eugenics and the abortion rights movement. Eugenics literally means good genes or good creation. The science of eugenics proposed that humans can be improved or perfected through selective breeding, and ensuring certain desirable traits are passed on and certain undesirable traits are not. Of course, elites saw this as an opportunity to control reproduction of the lower classes, and therefore a means to exterminate bad genes. Some eugenicists even saw the birth control pill as a tool to prevent the weak from reproducing. Eugenics eventually became strongly associated with Nazi Germany, and hence, post-World War II, the science of eugenics lost much of its credibility and steam. There wasn't as much support for it anymore. With all that being said, throughout the feminist movement, from questioning gender roles, questioning gender identity, and promoting gender confusion, from all of this, the modern LGBT movement took form. Believe it or not, in the early mid to 1900s, homosexuality was deemed illegal. And the American Psychiatric Association listed homosexuality as a sociopathic personality disturbance. In other words, it was labeled as a mental illness or a mental disorder. In June of 1969, the Stonewall Inn or the Stonewall Riots, well, that was the catalyst to everything. The Stonewall Inn, which was a New York establishment owned by the mafia, allowed customers to do whatever they wanted as long as they paid a premium. On June 28th, the police raided the Stonewall Inn for illegally selling alcohol and for violating gender-appropriate clothing laws, aka engaging in some sexual deviances or homosexuality. However, this turned into a full-blown riot. Hundreds of protesters fought the police, they surrounded police officers and media members and put them in the building, and the protesters set the building on fire. Yeah, it was intense, and the clashes went on for about a week. This started the modern-day gay or LGBT liberation movement, and this led to the first Pride Parade. What started with feminism, questioning gender roles and identity, all the way to sexual promiscuity and deviation, has led to the modern LGBT movement we see today. Ultimately, we see nations like Uganda implementing homosexuality policies, and as a result being threatened to face sanctions by the United States of America. Uganda, of course, is calling this blackmail. So is the LGBT movement truly grassroots from the bottom up, or is it in fact being pushed, sponsored, promoted from the top down? Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for the 8-part series on the LGBT movement. This has been For God and Country. I'm your guest host, Mohamad, aka That Muslim Guy. We'll see you next time.